The moment Kalen spoke the words out loud, the entire High Tribunal froze, as if the galaxy itself had paused to listen. Because what he had just claimed was not merely controversial, but impossible by every standard the assembled civilizations believed to be sacred truth. And when he calmly stated that humans could reproduce at any time of year, without seasons, ceremonies, or biological shutdowns, the living silk walls of the chamber pulsed faintly as alien delegates recoiled in visible disbelief, some in disgust, others in stunned curiosity. All of them suddenly aware that this was no longer a routine legal hearing, but the beginning of something deeply unsettling. As Princess Lysara leaned forward on her throne of symbiotic organisms and ordered him to repeat himself, her voice sharp, cold, and utterly certain that he was lying. Yet Kalen did not hesitate or soften the statement, repeating it exactly as before, which only made the reaction worse as a senior scholar made a choking sound. A scribe dropped their data slate, and whispered accusations of biological heresy rippled through the court. While Kalen thought with detached irony that the true shock of interstellar travel was discovering how an ordinary fact of life on Earth could become a moral outrage elsewhere, and when the princess demanded to know whether he truly expected the Empire to believe his species remained fertile through disasters, shortages, and endless administrative work cycles, Kalen answered dryly that those were often the most motivating conditions, a response the translator drone recorded without emotion, even as several delegates visibly shuddered, prompting Princess Lysara to declare such a biology impossible and unsustainable, insisting no intelligent species could function under such reckless continuity. To which Kalen responded with a shrug and explained that humans relied on rules, restraint, and social structures to manage their impulses, a statement that sent multiple officials scrambling through ancient protocols, searching for a crime that adequately described what they were hearing, until the head scholar, an ancient being resembling silver branches entwined with drifting tendrils, finally intervened and invoked the law of the High Matron, stating that any extraordinary biological claim required immediate and observable verification, a phrase that caused a heavy silence to fall as Kalen asked what exactly constituted verification, only for Princess Lysara to rise slowly from her throne and explain that imperial law was very clear, that claims of extended fertility demanded live validation on royal grounds, and that as the only fertile female present, she was obligated to volunteer herself for the process, a declaration that stunned the tribunal into silence broken only by a hushed murmur of, "For science," while Kalen realized that this had escalated far beyond debate into an experiment that could redefine humanity's place in the galaxy. A realization he voiced aloud when he clarified that they expected him to prove his claim with her while the entire court observed, to which the princess agreed without hesitation, adding a minor ceremonial restriction that only increased the chaos when a junior scribe asked an innocent question about human customs, and a protocol officer promptly fainted, forcing Kalen to acknowledge that the court did not believe him, but intended to expose him, a suspicion Lysara confirmed as she explained that her species' reproductive cycles were rare, sacred, and controlled, unlike the chaotic and frankly alarming behaviors she had seen in human records, comments Kalen chose not to defend as he agreed to proceed simply to end the argument, a confidence that surprised the princess enough to warn him that she did not tire easily, a warning Kalen met with calm assurance that made several scholars gasp, and as they turned together toward the ceremonial chamber normally reserved for symbolic rites rather than empirical trials, an elderly academic collapsed outright, because everyone present finally understood that this was no longer about proving a biological fact, but about witnessing the moment when two civilizations collided in a way that would forever alter how the galaxy viewed humanity. As Kalen and Princess Lysara entered the ceremonial chamber, the atmosphere shifted in a way that made even the most seasoned scholars uneasy, because this space was never meant for observation or judgment, but for symbolic rites whose meanings had been debated for centuries without ever being tested. And now the chamber's luminous platforms brightened instinctively, as if responding to the gravity of what was about to occur, while the tribunal assembled behind translucent observation barriers that offered visibility without participation, a design choice that suddenly felt like cowardice to several delegates who realized they were about to witness something they would never be able to unsee. And when the head scholar formally announced that the proceedings were beginning for the integrity of the Empire, his voice shook despite centuries of practiced authority, prompting a wave of frantic documentation as scribes activated recorders, translators calibrated emotional filters, and biologists leaned forward with professional fascination, barely masking personal alarm, while Kalen stood calmly at the center of it all, aware that every movement he made would be interpreted as evidence for or against his species. And Princess Lysara positioned herself opposite him with practiced composure that only partially concealed her curiosity, because while she had volunteered out of duty, she had not expected the human to accept so readily, and that quiet confidence unsettled her far more than open defiance would have, a realization that became apparent the moment Kalen stepped closer, prompting an audible gasp from the gallery as a scribe exclaimed that proximity had been initiated. Another questioned whether dual contact protocols applied, and a junior biologist began dictating observations in a flat, clinical tone that contrasted sharply with the chaos unfolding around him. Noting Kalen's steady posture and lack of hesitation, while Princess Lysara stiffened slightly and demanded in a low voice whether such narration was truly necessary, to which Kalen murmured that imperial law required thorough records, a reminder that made her jaw tighten as the process continued under the tribunal's watchful eyes, and almost immediately reactions rippled through the chamber as several elders recoiled, one crying out that sustained eye contact alone constituted a violation on at least 3 known worlds, while another whispered that the human appeared to be unreasonably calm, a fact confirmed when a translator drone reported stable emotional readings despite the unprecedented nature of the test. A calm that began to erode the princess's certainty as she realized this was not bravado but familiarity, prompting her to question under her breath why he showed no signs of fatigue or strain. A question Kalen answered honestly by explaining that what the court considered extreme was, for humans, simply ordinary. A statement that triggered an outburst from the observation deck as one scholar demanded confirmation that such endurance was routine. Another fainted outright, and the head scholar hissed for silence, declaring that interruption would compromise the validity of the data. A pronouncement that lent the moment a strange reverence as the chamber itself seemed to hum louder. Lights pulsing in response to shifts the instrument struggled to classify, while Princess Lysara fought to maintain her composure, reminding herself that this was a scientific procedure and not a personal trial, even as she became increasingly aware that her assumptions about human limitation were collapsing one by one. A realization underscored when the translator drone announced the completion of the first observational phase far sooner than anticipated, causing a stunned silence to fall as Kalen stepped back slightly and remarked with disarming casualness that the initial demonstration was complete, a statement that left Princess Lysara staring at him in disbelief as she processed the implication that this had not exhausted his claim, but merely introduced it. A shock that rippled through the tribunal as murmurs spread, and scribes exchanged panicked glances, some asking whether additional phases were implied, others whether the law accounted for such a possibility at all. And when Kalen met the princess's gaze without apology or triumph, she finally understood that this was no longer about proving him wrong, but about confronting the reality that humanity operated on a biological framework fundamentally incompatible with the galaxy's expectations, a truth that unsettled her far more than the experiment itself, because if humans were this different in something so basic, then every treaty, alliance, and assumption built around them was suddenly inadequate, a thought that weighed heavily as the head scholar reluctantly called for a brief recess to allow the tribunal to recalibrate, leaving the chamber buzzing with whispered theories, shaken beliefs, and the dawning realization that the galaxy had just underestimated a species that did not fit neatly into any known category. And as Princess Lysara remained where she was, gathering herself with visible effort, she looked at Kalen not as an accused liar or reluctant test subject, but as a representative of a civilization whose normal had just become everyone else's impossible. A perspective shift that marked the true beginning of the crisis, because while the science was already challenging doctrine, the consequences of accepting it had only just begun to unfold. When the tribunal reconvened, the atmosphere had fundamentally changed, because what had begun as a courtroom challenge now carried the weight of a historical turning point, and even the living silk walls seemed dimmer, as if the chamber itself were bracing for consequences it could not yet define, while scholars returned to their positions with expressions ranging from stunned reverence to outright dread, knowing that whatever verdict followed would ripple across hundreds of worlds. And as Princess Lysara rose to address the court again, her posture remained regal, but her certainty had softened into something more complex, a measured restraint shaped by the uncomfortable awareness that the human standing beside her had just forced the Empire to confront a truth it was never prepared to face, because Kalen was no longer simply a claimant defending an outrageous assertion, but living evidence of a biological reality that refused to align with established doctrine. A fact the head scholar acknowledged openly as he began summarizing preliminary findings in a voice that trembled despite centuries of experience, explaining that all recorded indicators supported the human's claim and that no known mechanism within imperial biology could adequately explain or refute what had been observed. A statement that sent murmurs through the chamber as younger scribes exchanged looks of awe while older delegates stared straight ahead as if afraid to blink. And when Princess Lysara spoke again, her tone was no longer dismissive, but carefully controlled as she addressed Kalen directly and asked whether his species truly considered this capability unremarkable. A question Kalen answered honestly by explaining that humans rarely viewed their own biology as extraordinary, having built cultures and laws around managing it, rather than venerating it. An explanation that unsettled many listeners because it suggested that humanity's strength lay not in excess but in adaptation, a concept that challenged several philosophical pillars of the Empire. And as debate erupted among the delegates over whether such adaptability made humans dangerous or dependable, the head scholar called for order and reminded the tribunal that fear was not evidence, prompting Princess Lysara to formally acknowledge that the challenge she had issued had been met, a declaration that echoed through the chamber and marked the official collapse of centuries-old assumptions, while Kalen stood quietly, aware that victory in such a context carried responsibilities far heavier than vindication, because proving humanity's difference meant accepting that the galaxy would now reassess every interaction with his species through a new and uncertain lens, a realization underscored when diplomatic aides hurried in with urgent messages from off-world observers already reacting to leaked data. And as Princess Lysara dismissed the tribunal for emergency deliberations, she lingered beside Kalen for a brief moment and spoke not as a ruler, but as an individual grappling with revelation, admitting that she had expected humiliation or confirmation of superiority and had instead encountered something far more destabilizing, a calm persistence that did not seek conquest yet could not be ignored. Words that Kalen received without triumph, as he replied that humanity had spent most of its history being underestimated by itself as well, an admission that surprised her enough to draw a faint, incredulous smile. And as they exited the chamber together amid whispered speculation and frantic record-keeping, the head scholar quietly sealed the session's records with a notation reserved only for paradigm-shifting events, because the science was no longer in dispute, and the real challenge now lay in what the Empire would do with this knowledge. As alliances, treaties, and social hierarchies trembled under the realization that humanity did not fit within existing biological limits, a truth that promised not war or domination, but something far more unsettling to a rigid galaxy: the necessity of change. And as Kalen was escorted toward diplomatic quarters rather than a holding cell, he understood that he had not simply defended a claim, but opened a door the universe could never again close, while Princess Lysara watched him go with a mixture of caution and curiosity, knowing that whatever came next would require more than law or science to navigate, because the moment had passed where humanity could be dismissed as an anomaly, and what followed would determine whether that difference became a bridge or a fracture across the stars. By the time the final session convened, the High Tribunal of Viril no longer felt like a place of judgment, but like the epicenter of a quiet aftershock spreading through the Empire, because the data had been verified, cross-checked, and reluctantly accepted, leaving no room for denial even among the most conservative scholars. And as the head scholar rose to deliver the closing declaration, his once pristine ceremonial robes were creased and dulled, a visible sign that the old order had been shaken, while delegates leaned forward with an intensity usually reserved for declarations of war, knowing that what came next would not merely resolve a case, but redefine how humanity would be classified, contained, or perhaps cautiously embraced. And when the verdict was spoken aloud, stating that human biology demonstrated continuous reproductive readiness outside all known cyclical frameworks, a hush fell over the chamber, so complete that even the translator drones paused for a fraction of a second before recording it, a silence broken only when Princess Lysara exhaled slowly and acknowledged that the court's challenge had been answered beyond dispute, her voice steady, but carrying an undercurrent of reluctant respect, as she formally withdrew her accusation of deception, a gesture that drew murmurs of disbelief from several delegates who had never witnessed a ruling princess concede error so openly. While Kalen accepted the decision without celebration, fully aware that validation came paired with scrutiny, because the galaxy rarely responded to the unknown with comfort, a truth reinforced when diplomatic envoys immediately began outlining provisional guidelines for human interaction, some urging caution, others advocating accelerated alliance talks, and a few quietly suggesting containment measures that were swiftly but not entirely dismissed, as Princess Lysara requested a private exchange with Kalen before formal adjournment, an unusual but permissible act that drew curious glances as they stood together beneath the chamber's fading glow. And when she spoke, her tone was no longer adversarial but contemplative, as she admitted that the experiment had forced her to confront not only human difference, but her own assumptions about control, cycles and strength, reflections Kalen met with equal honesty as he explained that humans had long lived with contradictions, capable of restraint and excess, creation and destruction, often simultaneously, a balance that confused others but defined them nonetheless. And for a brief moment the vast gulf between species felt narrower, bridged not by biology, but by shared uncertainty, before the head scholar formally closed the proceedings and declared the findings sealed and distributed across Imperial networks. A pronouncement that triggered a cascade of automated alerts and emergency councils on distant worlds, while a smaller drone quietly finalized its summary packet with a stark advisory classification warning that human norms did not align with established galactic expectations, a message that would soon circulate widely and inspire equal parts fascination and fear. And as Kalen was escorted from the tribunal not as a prisoner, but as a diplomatic asset, he became acutely aware that his life would never again be ordinary, because humanity had crossed an invisible threshold and could no longer be treated as a minor or predictable species, a realization echoed in Princess Lysara's expression as she watched him depart, understanding that her challenge had altered the trajectory of interstellar relations in ways no single ruling could undo. And while scholars debated implications and strategists drafted contingencies, a quieter transformation unfolded beneath the spectacle. The recognition that difference did not automatically signal threat, that adaptability could coexist with discipline, and that the universe had just been reminded it was larger, stranger, and more interconnected than its laws had allowed, a lesson that lingered as the living silk walls dimmed and the tribunal dispersed, leaving behind not chaos or scandal, but a profound and unsettling truth that humanity was neither myth nor menace, but something far more difficult to categorize, a species whose normal defied expectation, and whose presence would now demand understanding rather than dismissal, setting the stage for a future where coexistence would depend not on shared biology, but on the willingness of entire civilizations to evolve.